April 2010. A field near Frome in the southwest of England. A hospital chef named Dave Crisp is out with a metal detector. His day off, his hobby, nothing more. He'd already found a scatter of Roman coins nearby, so he's begging for more. Then the detector gives him what he later calls a funny signal. He starts digging. About 14 inches down, he hits something that isn't a coin. It's the rim of a pot. He does the one thing every archaeologist prays a detectorist will do, and almost none of them actually do. He stops digging and he calls it in. 3 days later, a team from the British Museum carefully lifts an intact Roman storage pot out of the ground. Inside it, 52,503 coins. 52,503. 160 kilograms of them. That is about the weight of a baby grand piano poured into a single clay jar for 17 centuries. It's one of the largest coin hoards ever found in Britain. And here's the twist that makes it matter for this story specifically. Almost none of that silver is actually silver. Most of it is bronze, dipped or washed in a thin layer of silver just good enough to fool a glance. It's some of the most aggressively debased currency the Roman Empire ever produced. And there is 52,503 examples of it, sitting in one hole in the English countryside, like a time capsule of a currency in the middle of a slow motion collapse. So, how does an empire's money end up this hollow? How does a currency that once held together 60 million people across 3 continents end up being buried by the fistful bronze pretending to be silver, worth barely anything at all? That's this video. This is the story of the Roman denarius and the 600-year con that quietly hollowed it out from the inside. Rewind to 211 BC. Rome is not yet the Rome of postcards and marble. It's a mid-sized power fighting for its life against Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who's just spent over a decade rampaging through Italy, and at one point came within a few days' march of the city itself. War is expensive. Rome's older currency, a clunky, heavy bronze system, isn't cutting anymore.
This is all the Republic has left! We cannot pay an army with this. You must make them understand.
So the Roman state does something practical, almost bureaucratic. It introduces a new silver coin minted, according to tradition, near the temple of Juno Moneta on the Capitoline Hill. They call it the denarius, containing 10, because it's worth 10 of the old bronze asses. It's a wartime fix. Nobody in that mint in 211 BC has any idea they have just created the currency that will outlive the Republic, outlive Caesar, and outlive most of what people currently call the ancient world. Here is the detail that gets missed in most retellings. This coin wasn't born out of ambition. It was born out of a cash flow emergency. Rome needed to pay soldiers who were quite literally standing between the city and destruction. And once that emergency passed, the coin didn't disappear. It became permanent, which is worth remembering because almost every major decision about this currency for the next 6 centuries gets made the exact same way, as an emergency fix that quietly becomes the new normal. Give this coin 2 centuries and something remarkable happens. It stops being a Roman coin and starts being the coin. the default currency of the entire Mediterranean world. As the legions push into Spain, then Greece, then North Africa, the denarius rides along in the soldiers' pay pouches. Under the standard set by Augustus, the coin settles at around 3.9 grams, roughly 95 to 98% pure silver, genuinely close to the real thing, not a rounding trick. Picture an actual legionary on the German frontier, cold, homesick, paid 4 times a year in a lump sum called the stipendium. When that offers counts silver denarii into his palm, stamped with a face he has never met and a city he may never see, the empire stops being an abstract idea. It's the weight in his hand. Here's something most people don't expect. Those coins traveled far outside Roman borders entirely. Archaeologists have pulled denarii out of the ground in Poland and Denmark and parts of India, places the legions never conquered. Merchants and tribal leaders wanted Roman silver specifically because it was reliable. That's the real power of a trusted currency. It doesn't need an army behind every transaction. It just needs a reputation. Early in 44 BC, something happens on Roman coinage that hasn't happened in the Republic's entire history. The moneyer Marcus Metius strikes a batch of denarii bearing the portrait of a living Roman, Julius Caesar, recently declared dictator for the 4th time. For roughly 2 centuries beforehand, only gods, goddesses, and dead ancestors appeared on the Roman coins. Living men didn't put their own faces on money. That was a habit associated with the Hellenistic kings, and Rome had spent generations defining itself as the opposite of a monarchy. Caesar's coin doesn't flatter me either. The engraving is brutally realistic. Deep neck creases, a receding hairline, sunken cheeks. Historians call this style verism. It's basically ancient political branding. Not look how godlike I am, but look how much I have sacrificed for Rome. 3 months later, he's dead, stabbed by a group of senators, including men he had personally pardoned on the Ides of March. And here's the detail that should be in every version of this story and almost never is. Caesar's assassins didn't just kill him, they minted a coin about it. Brutus's own denarius, struck to pay the troops he was raising for the civil war that followed, shows 2 daggers flanking a liberty cap, with the date of the assassination marked on the reverse. The men who murdered a man for putting his face on money used money to justify the murder. That's the power this kind already had by 44 BC. It wasn't just currency, it was a broadcast channel with no competitors. The closest thing the ancient world had to a state television network, except it fit in your kind purse.
The Emperor is dead. Move along now. Spread the word.
Rome, 64 AD. A fire tears through the city for 6 days, gutting entire districts. Nero, already infamous, already accused, probably unfairly, of fiddling while it burned, now faces the staggering bill for rebuilding a capital city from the ground up. He needs money fast, and he finds it in the one place that doesn't require raising taxes or admitting weaknesses: the mint itself. Nero's reform quietly reduces the denarius from roughly 3.9 grams down to about 3.4 grams and drops the silver purity from close to 98% down into the low 90s. Some modern metallurgical analysis puts it even lower, closer to 80% once you account for how the reform was actually executed at different mints. Either way, the math is the same. more coins struck from the same amount of silver. To an ordinary Roman buying bread in the forum, the coin looks identical. Same size, same emperor's face, same weight in the hand, close enough that nobody's complaining out loud. But money changers notice. They handle thousands of coins a week, and their hands develop a kind of muscle memory for weight and thickness. To them, something is off. Word spreads slowly, the way financial unease always does, not as an announcement, but as a rumor, a raised eyebrow, a merchant quietly weighing coins twice before accepting them.
This coin buys his eternal silence.
This is the moment worth pausing on, because it's not dramatic. No rights, no collapse, just one emperor solving one immediate cash problem by very slightly lying about what a coin was worth. Rome survives Nero's reign. It survives Nero's death 4 years later. What doesn't survive is the precedent. Every emperor after him now knows this lever exists. By the reign of Trajan, around 180, the denarius has slipped further, down to roughly 85% silver. Still usable, still recognizably the same coin the legends have trusted for generations. The decline so far has been slow enough that most people alive have never known anything else. Then, in 215 AD, Emperor Caracalla introduces something new, a larger coin, slightly thicker, with the emperor shown wearing a radiate crown instead of a laurel wreath. It's officially valued at 2 denarii. Here is the trick. That new coin, later nicknamed the Antoninius by modern historians, though Romans at the time just called it a double, doesn't actually contain twice the silver of a regular denarius. It contains roughly 1.5 times as much. Caracalla has essentially invented a coin that lies about its own value by design, baked directly into the denomination, rather than hidden in a gradual purity cut. It's a clever trick. It's also a one-way door. Once the market realizes the double coin isn't really worth double, both coins start losing credibility together. Merchants begin quietly favoring the older, more reliable denarii and holding them, while the new doubles flood into daily circulation. Economists have a name for this pattern today: Gresham's law. Bad money drives good money out of circulation, but because everyone hides the good stuff and spends the junk first. Rome, 3.5 centuries before the principle would even be named, discovers it the hard way, through a trial, error, and a growing pile of angry merchants. Rewind slightly to 211 AD, to a military camp near modern-day York, in the far north of Roman Britain. Emperor Septimius Severus, Caracalla's father, is dying. Gout, most likely, or some other slow illness that has been wearing him down for months. He's got 2 sons kneeling at his bedside, Caracalla and his younger brother Geta. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was alive at the time and had access to people close to the court, the old emperor's final advice to his son was blunt, almost brutally practical. Stay unified. Keep the army rich. Don't worry about anyone else.
My sons, the empire is yours.
Father, it will be mine. You think it yours alone.
Together. Swear it.
I will not share.
Nor I.
It's not poetry, it's a management strategy. And Severus had already lived it during his 18-year reign. He had raised the ordinary legendary base annual pay from around 300 denarii up to roughly 500, an increase of over 60%. and he had paid for a chunk of that raise the same way every emperor before him eventually did, by quietly trimming the silver content of the coins used to hand it out.
Soldiers, maintain the Empire's strength! Divide this gold and conquer the world!
For Severus, it worked. His troops adored him. His reign was stable by the standards of the era. But his sons took only half the lesson. Caracalla murdered Geta within about a year of their father's death. So much for stay unified. And then leaned entirely on the other half of Dad's advice. Keep the army rich, no matter the cost. 4 years later, that is exactly what produces the double denarius coin we just walked through. Caracalla didn't invent currency debasement. He just took a policy his father had used carefully and moderation to buy loyalty and floored the accelerator. 235 to 284 AD. Historians call this 3rd century crisis, and crisis barely covers it. In this roughly 50-year window, Rome churns through more than 20 legitimate and rival emperors, most of them murdered by their own troops within months of taking power. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes push across the borders faster than legions can respond. In the east, the newly aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire humiliates Roman armies so badly that at one point in 260 AD, they capture a Roman emperor alive on the battlefield. Valerian reportedly kept as a Persian trophy until his death. Every one of these emergencies cost money the treasury doesn't have, and every treasury official facing that gap reaches for the same lever Nero found a century and a half earlier. By the reign of Gallienus around 260 AD, this silver content of that double denarius coin has collapsed to somewhere around 5%. 5%. It's for all practical purposes a bronze coin with a thin silver wash scrubbed onto the surface to fool a glance. And increasingly, not even that. We actually know exactly how bad prices got because of a document that survives from just a few decades later. When Diocletian issues his edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, an empire-wide attempt to freeze runaway costs by law, the surviving inscriptions preserve staggering detail. A single modius of wheat, about 8 liters, capped at 100 denarii. A pound of purple dyed silk, or strangely a first-class line for public games, both priced at 150,000 denarii. An average Roman soldier's total annual pay, on paper, around 15,400 denarii. According to later economic reconstructions, one item that cost roughly 1/8 of a single denarius under earlier stable conditions was now costing the 8 full, heavily debased denarii. That's not a rough estimate of hardship. That's a documented, math-checkable inflation rate of around 6,300%. Picture a baker in a mid-sized provincial town, the kind of man who has run the same shop his whole life, watching the same fistful of coins that used to buy a week of flour now barely cover a single loaf. Multiply that baker by every household in an empire of 60 million people, and you start to understand why this wasn't just an economic footnote. It was a slow-motion trust collapse, playing out in every marketplace, every payday, every transaction, all at once. Soldiers, the one group the empire absolutely cannot afford to alienate, start demanding pay in kind instead of coin. Grain, land grants, anything real, anything that can't be quietly diluted by an official with access to the mint. Diocletian comes to power in 284 AD, right at the tail end of the crisis, and he tries to fix the currency problem head-on. First, new coin types. The silver argentius, a bronze nummus with a thin silver coating. Then in 300 AD, That edict on maximum prices backed by the harshest penalty available. Death for sellers who charge more than the listed maximum. And in a detail that still shocks modern readers, death for buyers who agreed to pay it. It doesn't work. You cannot out-legislate the arithmetic of a currency people no longer trust. Merchants simply stop selling at a loss. Goods vanish from official markets and reappear in black markets instead.
Take it and go. May the gods protect us.
According to the Christian writer Lactantius, who despised Diocletian, the price controls provoked actual bloodshed over minor pricing disputes. Within a handful of years, by most modern accounts, the edict is quietly abandoned, unenforced, essentially dead before Diocletian himself steps down from power in 305 AD. Then comes Constantine, and instead of trying to control prices, he does something almost stubbornly simple. He creates a brand new coin made of gold, and he refuses to touch its purity. Introduced in 312 AD, the solidus, literally solid, is struck at exactly 72 coins to a Roman pound, roughly 4.5 grams of nearly pure gold each. At the moment of its introduction, one single solidus was worth an estimated 275,000 of the debased denarii still floating around, which tells you, in one number, exactly how far the old silver coin had fallen. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. It works. Not for a decade, not for a generation. The solidus holds its weight and purity for roughly 700 years, anchoring the Byzantine economy long after the western half of the empire has already collapsed into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. Merchants from Ireland to India come to trust a single gold coin, stamped with the Roman emperor's face, centuries after Rome itself is a memory in the West. Meanwhile, the old denarius, the coin that funded the war against Hannibal, carried Caesar's face, paid soldiers on 3 continents, simply fades out of daily use. By the 5th century, as Germanic kings carve up the western provinces, nobody is bothering to melt it down for anything more than its scrap value. So let's go back to that field near Rome for a second. Every one of those 52,503 coins was at some point somebody's actual money, somebody's week of bread, somebody's soldier's pay, a farmer's saving, or an offering to a god they were hoping might fix things. Whoever buried that pot, and archaeologists still argue about it, whether it was hidden for safekeeping or given as a religious offering, was living through the exact currency collapse we have just spent the last 15 minutes unpacking. They just didn't have the historical hindsight to call it that. To them, it was just Tuesday, just another year of coins that bought a little less than they used to. Here's the strange thing about the whole story. Rome survived Hannibal at its gates. It survived a 50-year stretch that chewed through more than 20 emperors. It survived plagues, invasions, and the assassination of its most famous leader in broad daylight in a room full of witnesses. What it never fully recovered from was something far less cinematic. The slow, repeated decision made by emperor after emperor, generation after generation, to lie just a little about what its own money was actually worth. And that coin didn't disappear when Rome did. Its name is still sitting inside languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people right now. The Italian dinaro, the Spanish dinero, the Arabic dinar, echoes of a kind first struck in a wartime emergency near a temple on a hill 22 centuries ago. Every hyperinflation story since carries a faint outline of the same lesson Rome learned first and learned the hard way. Weimar Germany wheeling cash around in wheelbarrows just to buy bread, more recent currency losing most of their value in a matter of months. And currency isn't really metal or paper or a number on a screen. It's a promise. And a government that quietly breaks that promise even a little, even with the good intentions, is borrowing against a trust that doesn't always come back. Rome rose on the back of a coin people believed in, and it came apart, in part because that belief got spent one small cut at a time for 600 years, until a hospital chef with a metal detector dug up the proof. If this kind of story, empires, money, and the quiet decisions that unravel them, is your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribes, because there is a lot more of this coming. And tell me in the comments, which forgotten currency or which vanished empire should we dig into next?